The small town of Dry Creek was no stranger to cruelty, but even the hardened ranch hands fell into a hush when a stumbling drunk dragged his daughter onto the auction block one hot summer evening. The girl couldn't have been more than 20, her eyes wide and distant, her dress torn and soiled as though she had been dragged through dust. "She's deaf," the father slurred, yanking her forward roughly. "Can't hear a thing, but she'll work, she'll clean, she'll do as told. Who'll take her?" His words rang out with bitter shame as the crowd erupted in ugly laughter. Some men joked about her silence. Others waved him off like she wasn't worth the rope that bound her wrists. But at the back of the crowd stood Caleb Rawlins, a solitary rancher known more for his quiet ways and weathered face than for his words. His heart clenched at the sight of the girl, so small, so out of place, trembling like a fawn. Something in her eyes, though muted by fear, spoke louder than any voice. The auctioneer barked impatiently. "$1 to start, anyone?" 50 cents. Silence, more laughter. Then Caleb stepped forward, his voice steady. $5. The crowd gasped, then snickered louder. "Guess loneliness makes a man desperate," someone shouted, but Caleb didn't waver. He handed over the bills, walked to the platform, and gently helped the girl down, draping his own coat around her shoulders. She flinched at first, but when his hand steadied her without force, her gaze met his for a fleeting moment, and though she said nothing, Caleb saw it, the faintest flicker of hope, a fragile ember in the ashes of despair. The ride back to Caleb's ranch was quiet but heavy with unspoken thoughts. The girl sat beside him, clutching his coat tightly around her as the wagon bumped along the dusty trail. Caleb studied her from the corner of his eye. Her hair was tangled but shone in the fading sunlight, her lips pressed tight as though holding back words she could never speak. He tried once to ask her name, but when she didn't respond, he simply nodded to himself and said, "We'll figure it out." When they reached the ranch, Caleb lifted her down carefully, showing her the small cabin he called home, the barn where horses shifted restlessly, and the corral that stretched beneath the vast prairie sky. She followed, silent but observant, her eyes darting everywhere, taking it all in. That night he fixed her a plate of beans and bread. She ate cautiously at first, as if expecting the food to be snatched away, but when she realized he wasn't watching to judge, her pace quickened. Caleb leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. He had bought her to save her from further cruelty, but he had no plan beyond that. Still, as she sat by the firelight, her hands folded neatly, her eyes flickering with faint life, he knew one thing. He couldn't let the world crush her again. When he finally said, "You can stay here, safe," her gaze lifted to his, and for the first time since he'd seen her, she gave the smallest nod. It wasn't much, but to Caleb, it was the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. Days turned into weeks, and the girl, whom Caleb had started calling Lena because the sound of it seemed to fit her, began to carve a place into his quiet world. She worked tirelessly around the ranch, feeding the chickens, mending torn sacks, sweeping the cabin with diligence. Yet her silence was constant, her eyes always listening, though her ears, he believed, could not. Caleb tried to teach her simple signs, pointing to things and making gestures, but often she would surprise him. One morning, as he chopped wood, he muttered under his breath, "Damn axe is dull," not realizing she was near. To his shock, Lena appeared from the cabin holding a sharpening stone. Placing it beside him, he stared at her, confused. "How did you—" But she only smiled faintly, then walked back inside. The moments kept piling. He'd whistle for the dog, and she'd come leading it before he finished. He'd mumble about rain coming, and she'd already be gathering the wash off the line. Slowly, suspicion gnawed at him. Could it be she wasn't deaf at all? One evening, determined to test his thought, Caleb sat across from her by the fire and whispered, barely audible, "Lena, if you can hear me, look at me." For a long moment she stayed still, staring into the flames. His heart sank, thinking he'd been foolish. But then, slowly, almost painfully, her eyes lifted to meet his, filled with fear and shame. Caleb's breath caught. She heard. She had heard all along. The revelation broke something between them and yet began to mend. Something deeper. Caleb reached for her hand, but she pulled away, tears spilling down her cheeks as she whispered, hoarse and trembling, "Don't tell them, please." Her voice cracked as though unused for years, each word strained. Caleb sat frozen, stunned by the sound. but his heart ached more at the plea in her tone. "Why hide it?" he asked softly. She shook her head violently, curling into herself. "My father, he said I was cursed. Said silence was the only way I wouldn't anger him. He told everyone I was deaf so no one would expect me to speak, so no one would listen when I begged for help." Her words tumbled out, broken and raw as years of fear spilled into the room. Caleb's chest tightened with rage at the thought of her suffering, but he kept his voice calm. "You don't have to hide anymore." "Lena, not here." She shook her head, sobbing. "If people know, they'll laugh again, like always." Caleb leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. "Let them laugh. They don't know strength when they see it. You survived. That makes you stronger than any of them." Slowly, she looked at him, her tears reflecting the firelight. For the first time, she allowed him to hold her hand, her fingers trembling but clinging. And though she was terrified, Caleb felt the weight of her trust settle into his soul like a vow. She wasn't just a girl he saved, she was someone he would fight for until his last breath. From that night on, their lives intertwined in ways neither could deny. Lena began to speak more, haltingly at first, her voice rusty but beautiful in its fragility. Caleb listened with patience, never rushing her, never judging, just waiting as though every word she offered was a treasure. With each passing day, her laughter came easier, her steps lighter, her eyes brighter. The ranch, once silent and lonely, now echoed with life. The clatter of dishes, the hum of her voice, the occasional playful banter between them. The townsfolk, once cruel, began to notice the change. When Caleb brought Lena to the market, heads turned, whispers stirred. But this time he stood tall, her hand secure in his, daring anyone to mock. And when someone muttered about the deaf girl, Lena lifted her chin and said clearly, "I hear just fine." The silence that followed was sweeter than any music. That evening, as the prairie sky burned orange and purple, Caleb sat beside her on the porch. "You changed this place, Lena," he said quietly. She smiled, tears shimmering, and whispered, "You gave me a reason to." His heart swelled, and for the first time in years, he felt whole. She had been sold for shame, silenced by cruelty, but with him, she had found her voice again. And with her, he had found love he thought he'd never know. Together under the endless sky, they weren't broken souls anymore, they were home. And that, my friends, is the story of how a lonely rancher bought a girl thought to be deaf, only to discover her greatest secret, and in the process, both of them found healing and love. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful Wild West stories filled with redemption, courage, and romance.